commend this bill to the House.
Mr Speaker, I really want to refer back to Te Ururoa's speech. I enjoyed his words. There were words of compassion for those that require the work, the carers, and for those that are in the workforce. But what I have to ask, Mr Speaker, is where were the Māori Party when the picket lines were out there? Where were the Māori Party when the discussions were taking place between the workers and the unions? Where was the Māori Party when it was going through the courts? There was silence from the Māori Party, and we heard Mr Te Ururoa congratulate Tariana Turia, who is supposed to be our Minister of Disability Issues. But unfortunately, Mr Speaker, we heard nothing from her on this very important issue. As Labour's spokesperson for disability issues, it does give me great pleasure, Mr Speaker, to speak on a bill that Labour indeed support. National has dragged its heels, along with its coalition partners, the Māori Party and the ACT Party, on this payout for far too long, and now, unless it's treated with urgency, disability support workers may need to wait until next year for much-needed compensation. We applaud the workers and unions in the sector for their persistence and patience, Mr Speaker, incredible patience that they've exhibited, which has led to this court ruling and subsequent government payout. And I call the Māori Party out on this, having done work on the non-regulated health workforce, and knowing that a lot of these carers, Mr Speaker, are Māori, are Pacific, are new migrant, and many of them are women, Mr Speaker, women who have families to look after, women who are on the minimum wage, and in this case not even on the minimum wage, women who are attempting to look after their families but unable to do so because they're paid so poorly. So I do call the Māori Party out on this. They should have been much more vocal at the time that this case was going through, rather than waiting till now when the fight has finally been won, Mr Speaker. Labour supports this bill as it provides disability support workers with fair pay and compensation for the essential services they provide to the most vulnerable people in our communities. The settlement reached will entitle disability workers in New Zealand the right to the full minimum wage for sleepover work, compared to $3.77 at present. $3.77 at present. Looking at that rate of pay, it is no wonder that this ruling has been upheld by the courts, whilst the national government have unnecessarily continued to stall the process of a just outcome. The abysmal rates of pay for sleepover claimants mean that of those seeking compensation, many will receive between $7,000 and $10,000 in back pay for sleepover work carried out in the last 5 years. And Mr Speaker, that money will mean a lot to those workers. To many of the people in the House tonight, that isn't a lot of money, but to these particular workers, that is a lot of money. And it will mean not only a lot to them, but also their family. Labour applauds the workers and unions in the sector for their persistence and patience, which has led to the ruling that sleepovers are work, Mr Speaker. And as my colleague, Mr Grant Robertson, said earlier, it really isn't accurate to describe this as a sleepover when at any time during the night these workers can be called upon to have to assist in some way or another. They do have to have one eye opened while they're undertaking this work, Mr Speaker. And there is a sense of responsibility, accountability for these workers, a high level of responsibility and accountability for these workers. We support ensuring that all working New Zealanders receive a fair working wage, Mr Speaker, and this will rectify the situation that these workers have found themselves in for now. What we do need to look at is actually increasing that minimum wage so that they're not on an abysmal $13, that they can actually go up to at least a $15 minimum wage, Mr Speaker, and Labour has promised that they will do that. Not only is a commitment to fair pay a boost for workers, but it will provide people with disabilities and their families assurance that they will keep receiving good quality care from qualified and experienced staff, a repercussion that the government seemed to have neglected when calculating the cost of stalling. I've met with a number of people and organisations impacted by the government's inaction and can say, Mr Speaker, that this bill will help ease their extreme anxiousness and fears surrounding the care of their children and the retention of quality workers in the disability sector. As I've said before, the government has already dragged its heels on the settlement for far too long and wasted valuable time and resources fighting workers' claims in both the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, fighting their claims, fighting just claims. Just a year ago, Tony Ryle was ruling out any back pay for workers, stating that the liability rested with the employer. Tony Ryle's former excuse that a settlement would cost the government $500 million has been shown to have been scaremongering, as the compromise settlement is costing the government a reasonable $120 million, Mr Speaker. Absolutely, as Darian Fenton has said, only because the workers and the unions are reasonable. The government were willing to pull out all the stops for multinational Warner Brothers, so why so reluctant to give workers a fair pay for a fair day's work? We're grateful that National has finally heeded Labor's call to treat this legislation with urgency and pass it before the House rises. This sector does essential work for our most vulnerable citizens, Mr Speaker, and the way in which we treat our disability support workers reflects the value that the national government places on those they care for. The government's reluctance to properly pay health and disability workers for the essential services they provide is symptomatic of the wider underfunding of the health sector. While a compromise has now been negotiated, it is more in line with National's interests in election year than it is with the needs of those disability support workers. Thank you, Mr Speaker.